Hello and welcome to Photo 22's headline talk series, Photo Live. It's great to see an in-person audience. Welcome and thank you for joining us. And also hello to those joining online. My name is Lindsay Gosper and I'm the events producer at Photo 2022. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on whose lands we meet today, the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Photo 2022 International Festival of Photography is currently taking place in galleries and public spaces across Melbourne and regional Victoria, featuring 123 artists in 90 exhibitions. The whole festival responds to one theme, being human. Photo Live delves further into the contemporary human condition and addresses the social and cultural role photography plays in our lives across 8 events. We'll also explore through these talks how art can activate cities and public spaces. I'm excited for this evening's Photo Live talk, Human Rights. Our chair today is Melissa Miles, Associate Dean, Research, Monash University, and our guest speakers are Photo 22 exhibiting artists, Poulomi Basu and Phuong Ngo, and Dr Shahidul Alam, writer, photographer, activist, and adjunct professor with RMIT University. I'd like to thank our Photo Live partners, ACME, Metro Tunnel Creative Program, the Monash Gallery of Art, as well as our education partners, RMIT, Monash University, and Photography Studies College. For those people online, we have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which you're able to ask questions at any time during the talks today, and we'll have time for questions at the end of the talk. We hope you enjoy the event and that you can join us for the Photo Live talks, the remaining talks we have in the series. We have another one coming up this evening. I'll now hand it over to Melissa. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks everyone for coming. It's lovely to see you. So the 3 fabulous panelists that we have joining us tonight all address injustices and advocate for change using photography, and they do that in different ways. I'll very quickly introduce you to our 3 panelists. So Shahidul is up on the screen there. Thank you, Shahidul, is a photojournalist, writer, activist, and curator. He spent 30 years documenting issues of human rights and political upheaval in Bangladesh. He was arrested and tortured in 2018 for criticising his government and spent 107 days in jail, but was released on bail following a huge global campaign. He was also named one of the Guardians, the journalists who were named as Time Magazine's Persons of the Year in 2018. So welcome, Shahidul. We're also joined by Palomi Basu, who's a transmedia artist, photographer and activist who has become widely known for her very influential work, Blood Speaks, part of which is here as part of Photo 2022, Centralia and To Conquer Her Land. Throughout her practice, she advocates for the rights of women and girls in many different ways, including in the implications of menstrual exile, experiences of women soldiers and conflict. And Phuong Ngo. Phuong is an artist and curator living and working here in Naarm in Melbourne. His practice is concerned with the interpretation of history, memory and place and how it imparts individual and collective identity. His projects have explored the experiences of refugees, the French colonization of Vietnam and the ongoing legacies of colonial structures. So please welcome our guests. So the idea of this evening is we'll have all 4 of us will have a conversation about some of the issues that come up in their practice. And then after about 40-45 minutes, we'll open up to audiences' questions. So Shahidul, I might start with you. You moved from your chemistry research into photojournalism and photography and developed what became a very high profile career. At the time when you transitioned into photography, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about why you made that leap and what you saw as the benefits or the power of photographic witness and photojournalism in advocating for change and human rights.
I need to unmute. Well, thank you first for having me. I'd like to bring the story to now, actually. I mean, I think one of the reasons we do what we do is because of the inequalities that exist. Yesterday, Shireen was murdered in Palestine. You have all this talk about genocide in Ukraine, yet the conflict in Palestine and Israel is considered political and will never be considered an issue of war crimes or be taken into account. It's pretty well known that this was a murder, very clinically made, done, yet this inequality that exists is what took me to take on a very powerful medium. Now, in answer to your question, the reason I took it on was very clinical. I needed to fight inequality, and I was going to take on the most powerful tool that existed. To my mind, that was photography. It continues to be photography, though had I started today, I would probably have worked on social media as well, though I'm active there. But it's the way we use photography, I think. It's not simply photography itself. I mean, on the one hand, the vocabulary I've used has changed quite a lot. Photography is a medium that lends itself very well to what is in front of your lens. It renders those things very well. It's a perfectly suited medium for that. It's not as good a medium for rendering what is invisible. Yet a lot of what happens is underneath the surface. So much of what I've been doing in recent times has been about extrajudicial killings, about disappearances, and part of it has been the challenge of developing a vocabulary and a mechanism through which you can tell things which are not as well seen. And I'll move away a little bit to the type of interactions we now do. I mean, you can't probably see it. I'm wearing a T-shirt, which is in Bangla. Polo will know very well. Hirok Raja Deshe. Hirok Raja is a fictional character in a very famous film by Satyajit Ray, and it's a tyrant king who's surrounded by psychopaths. Now, we live in a climate of fear. People are scared to speak. People are very worried about what happens. I mean, in a typical Bangladeshi situation, if you were to meet, you would first put your mobile phones away. You would talk in whispers. You would use metaphors because Big Brother's always watching. Given that situation, one of the things we try and do is create space for others. And what we've tried to do in our physical space is create a safe space where people of different sexuality, of different gender, of different ethnic persuasions, and for whatever reason, are scared elsewhere to speak out, but here they can. And the way we are also doing it is through using tools which people might use. I mean, it's dangerous for people to speak out, but you might be okay wearing a T-shirt, having a bookmark, and the bookmark is about a tyrant king. No reference to anyone directly, of course. We have things like this is a murder of two journalists who were investigating a sensitive story, and it's never been resolved, and it will not be resolved. We have another T-shirt. This one talks about rape and talks about how what you're wearing has nothing to do with rape. We have a mug, and the picture at the back is of a young man called Nur Hussain. And on the 10th of November, 1987, he painted on his back, "Let democracy be free." And he came out in protest, and he was killed by police bullets. And he has since become an icon of our resistance. This is about Begum Ruqya, a very powerful feminist who lived over 100 years ago. And there is this perception that feminism is something very Western and discovered by the West. The fact that we had such powerful feminists working over so many years ago in very repressive regimes is one of the statements we try and make. But to come back to your question, I think what we've tried to do is not merely produce photography, but also engage with photography in a manner that hasn't been tried before. And one of my recent exhibits is called Embracing the Other, and there I tackle Islamophobia. And one of the ways in which I'm doing it is the show actually took place inside a mosque, which has traditionally been a very conservative space where people have felt photography could not be permitted. So you're trying to push those frontiers at all levels, and that's what I try and do.
Thanks, Shahidul. And that comment about very powerful feminist segues very nicely into you, Palomi. And thinking about your practice in the way that you fuse different types of media, you're a transmedia artist, you're thinking about how we can extend issues and ideas through different types of media. I wonder if you could speak to your own particular practice as an expanded practice and your politics, and how connected your practice and your politics are.
Sorry, I had forgotten to unmute myself. Oh, hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. And apologies for the scruffy look. It's very early in the morning. I am a transmedia artist and activist based between Kolkata and just outside of London. The crux of my practice is really intersectional feminism, and how sort of this idea that feminism and feminism from the global south sort of permeates through other intersectional issues, which is both environmental justice and other related issues of white supremacy and everything, but through an intersectional approach that addresses that how feminism and patriarchy is basically the biggest problem that challenges women, not only women, but also the environment today, and how both of these are connected to women who come from the global south and the majority world, and how what happens to our bodies and what happens to our land directly impacts the climate and the environment today. So a lot of my practice is about empowering and sort of conquering sort of that journey, what it means for a woman, women who are living under extremely oppressive patriarchal regimes, to sort of conquer their shame and come out and find themselves in spaces where they should be reclaiming with agency, and how we reclaim our bodies and how we do it through a lens of sort of self-care and world building, and how basically our bodies are sites of political warfare as women who've had a historical oppressive past, and how we use that to address current issues of environmental justice and climate change and white supremacy, and how women of color and women from the global south have always been impacted and have been on the front line of these issues, but they've always been ignored. And how, so all my work is kind of like transmedia. So I work across multiple mediums, which could be photography, photo books, to film, virtual reality, and even performance. So I use a lot of magical realism and surrealism in my work to sort of tell stories that are sort of sometimes difficult to understand or see. I used to have a career in photojournalism in my early life, well, not that early, but maybe 10 years ago. But I kind of segued and moved away from it. I like to use both the real and the fantastical to combine tales that are that tell you stories of race, violence, justice, but also above all love.
What does that fantastical element do you think, when you're addressing really complex issues like human rights issues, where so much is incredibly overwhelming and intangible? What does that fantastical element do, particularly when you're dealing with those questions?
Yeah, I think what fantasy does is basically what fiction does is opens up a universe of possibilities, which is not possible to convey through facts sometimes. And I feel like that is an important space for a person to be, where their mind can transcend beyond what they're just saying, and that is a very important thing. That is very important, that you challenge your audience so that their mind can journey into different places. That is very difficult to achieve when you're just looking at fact-based work. And I feel like when you combine this realm of docufiction, you kind of put your audience in a place where they are able to journey, and they're able to almost viscerally have an experience where they can put themselves into those situations, which sometimes may not happen when you're using fact-based works, because it kind of divides you between us and them and all these other issues. Some of the things I faced in my career, because everything became, everything is seen through this white Western gaze and white feminism. So it's very hard to understand where we are placed and what our history of resistance and struggle has been. So I feel like if sometimes imaginative ways of storytelling can really trigger serious topics and issues in a way that are far more powerful than just merely using fact-based work, because truth is, for me, is an amalgamation of different perspectives and is a collision of different perspectives and ideas. And I like my audience to sort of be able to understand those complexities that exist in truth and try to understand, what it is overall, because we live in a world of gray. There is no black and white. And what I learned from my 10 years of being in photojournalism is that there is no black and white. I mean, there is a truth, and my truth may not be as important, as the same as your truth, but it's important that we all share and understand the different perspectives without being this moral arbiter of truth and authority that often photojournalism can tend to be. The photographer becomes the messenger and carries a lot of power. And I feel like that's not right, because if you're looking at it from the lens of social practice, it's important to invite other voices. It's important to invite those other versions and then try to understand how we can possibly arrive at some sort of conclusion, in our practice and our work in what we're trying to show in the world. And I think Centralia does that very well in the book, because it invites activists into the work. It invites grassroots tribal indigenous journalists into the work. It has me in the work as well. So it's like an amalgamation of different voices that make the book. And so, yeah, sometimes I keep telling people, a lot of my work has science fiction as well. And I keep telling people science fiction is not about the future, it's about the present. It's like looking into the mirror and seeing the back of your head, so how do we use more interesting ways of telling stories in today's world that can really have an impact, but also take you towards these ideas of futurities? What is South Asian futurism? What does that look like? And what is its place in the world today from an intersectional feminist lens?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Phuong, there were some interesting points there that connect to your work, that your particular approach to collaboration is really interesting. That's a great one to speak to, but also the way that you approach your work in a manner that is extending beyond addressing the issues like asylum seeker policy or French colonization of Vietnam, but you also engage in larger processes and practices through collaboration that deal with a larger institutional critique. So I wonder if you could speak to some of that.
That's a big question.
It is a big one.
It's a huge question. I guess for me, institutional critique, and probably more rightly so in institutional agitation, is a massive methodology in how I kind of approach making. I come from a Vietnamese refugee background. I was born on Kaurna country in which is Adelaide. So I don't know anything else. I've never lived in the global South. So for me to speak about it it's quite a fraught place to come from as someone who has grown up in a particular level of class and privilege. So for me, working within the context of kind of so-called Australia, so colonized migrant settler Australia is kind of where I kind of situate my practice in trying to understand what it means to exist in this space and what are the kind of the low hums of human rights violations that exist, and how I either adhere to them, contribute to them, or speak to them, because I don't consider myself an activist. I think an activist is very different from what I do. But what I do is try to manipulate certain situations to get particular outcomes that will, I hope, draw attention to certain issues, but I don't know whether or not they do, because contemporary art, which is the space that I situate myself on, is hyper-capitalist. It's neoliberal, it's neo-colonial, it's we're creating objects and images of people to be consumed. So I'm not a very good photographer. I work predominantly with archives and existing images. So Google Images is, I consider, my ultimate database or my ultimate archive to work with. Particularly because there are in situations and kind of going back and looking at that idea of photojournalism and the problematics behind that, in that we live in an age where cameras are so readily available. So there are people telling their own stories. Whether or not we are needed to do that for them is kind of another question. Or are we there to catalyze how they tell their stories, like introduce it to the world rather than tell the stories for them? So there's these huge human rights issues that we should probably be unpacking as people who are interested in photography, and how photography kind of can, in many cases, be the violator of human rights as well as kind of presenting violations of human rights. And it's kind of a chicken and egg situation for me, where kind of like when we look at the core of human rights, and I think I'm going a bit off tangent here, been talking about kind of big institutions, but the nation state is the biggest institution that we can think of beyond kind of transnational or multinational organizations. But when we look at human rights, the people who are the guarantors of those human rights are the nation state, and the key violators are also the nation state. So we live in this situation where it's cyclical, kind of the violator is the protector of human rights as well. So what do we do to navigate that space, and how do we contribute to that as well, as violators of human rights is quite crucial. So for me, projects like, you would have seen a couple of receipts pop up behind us. That was a commission project for the museum, Monash Gallery of Art. And it was commissioned in response to COVID, but the way that it was framed was through this idea of supporting artists who really didn't need the financial support to make the work. And so the money that came from that I gave to a mutual aid fund that supported 90 families across Melbourne during the pandemic, and the receipts are the outcome. And so there are these kind of ways that I collaborate that bring to light questions of authorship, authenticity, challenging the archives, but also complicating the ways in which museums collect and produce works, and how in doing that they can act in a way that is patriarchal and capitalist and neocolonial. Did that answer your question?
It did, and it raised so many more. I think that point that you made about photography or photographers being violators of human rights in documenting human rights abuses is a very powerful one. There's that stereotype. Well, it's not a stereotype, it's a thing, of photographers helicoptering in, snapping the Pulitzer Prize winning image, and then out again. And what strikes me about all three of your work is not only your collaborative practices, and it'd be good to talk more about that, but how you focus on bringing others along and being responsible to others. So Shahidul, I might ask you if you could speak to perhaps some of the institutional development work that you've done and the way that you bring others along.
Well, firstly, the reason we set up DRIC, which is the oldest of the institutions I'm involved with, that was set up in 1989. And it was largely set up in response to this very stereotypical representation we have of countries like Bangladesh, which I call majority world countries, because I don't like the term third world, which has been given to us by people we didn't choose to represent us. Now, the reason we did that really stems from an African proverb, which I take to heart. It says something like, until the lions find their storytellers, stories about hunting will always glorify the hunter. And in a very unequal world, and I began by talking about the assassination of Shireen, the fact that that can happen with such impunity in a world where so much talk is about war crimes and genocide and oppression, it is just ridiculous. I mean, we can be so comfortable with the indiscretions by some people, and yet the indiscretions by others suddenly become center stage. So DRIG was set up as a platform for local storytellers to tell their stories. As we went along, once you realize that if you're going to fight a war, then you need soldiers, we set up the School of Photography, Pathshala, and that was set up in '98. We've also done workshops in other countries, and I've been involved in teaching globally as well. I mean, that's how I first got in touch with Poulomi, for instance. I think, wasn't it Poulomi in a workshop in Kolkata many years ago?
Yes,
but,
yes.
But since then, we've also taken on, we've set up a photo festival similar to yours, which we set up in 2000, called Chobi Mela, which was really one of the earliest photo festivals in the region, and has been the sort of precursor for many other festivals that have taken place. But we've also set up an agency called Majority World, and the term Majority World itself questions this definition that we've inherited, and it essentially represents photographers in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and underrepresented photographers in places like Australia and North America, for instance. So one of the things repressive regimes try to do is to destroy institutions. They've, in my country anyway, they've destroyed the police, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and they've actually destroyed the education system. What we are trying to do is, through 3 areas of intervention, media, education, and culture, try to counter that, build institutions that are resilient, that can create spaces for other people to talk back.
Thank you, Shahidul. And Palomi, you have quite an extended activist practice as well. You complement and use your artwork to advance real change and support the agency of others. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that, please.
Yeah, so I think if we just, to start with, Blood Speaks, the work, Ritual of Exile, that's on show. I mean, look, I grew up watching people parachute into my part of the world, as you said, take photographs, go away, won their Pulitzer Prizes, and and that's it, gone. And this is happening even now. So I have a very difficult, uncomfortable relationship with assignment industry in photojournalism. And, I felt like it's very hard as photographers from the majority world or from the global south and as women, to be really seen. I felt like no matter how hard we try, we're always invisible, It's very hard to be seen as a woman, and to be to get the trust to give you those long assignments, that gives you sustained time to embed yourself within a community, to do meaningful, real, challenging work. So I took it upon myself, when I was trekking through Nepal and I saw women in exile due to menstrual exiles, which was having psychological, emotional, and physical consequences on them. It's something I've seen growing up as a Hindu girl in India. We've had more milder forms of misogynistic practices around, say, blood politics, and how, from the time a woman period starts, everything changes, that's the time when a girl is moving from puberty, to becoming from a girl to a woman. A woman's sexuality is really feared, in oppressive, patriarchal, exclusively male societies. And so to such an extent that women were getting raped and murdered and killed and they were dying, not just like losing, not just if you talk about like the repercussions of what the problems of like menstrual exile is for people with, say, endometriosis or like PMDD or like other things that women were suffering, but also the isolation and the dangers that came with it. So I took it upon myself to really start a campaign very early on in my work. So I went in 2013. I realized that as photographers, we're not heroes, you know, we have a lot of work to do. And it's really about, again, engaging ideas of social practice and putting women in the center of it, you know, giving them the agency to tell their own stories. Because I realized when one woman came out, more started coming out to tell their stories. And it became a real like powerful situation where it was the survivors were coming out to talk about their own sort of the violence that they were facing. And so I started forming coalitions pretty early on in my career. I started engaging in 2013. I started working with academics. I started working with grassroots activists. I engaged a big charity, and together in 2014, we launched a campaign called To Be a Girl. So what it is to be a girl who's 16, you know, in India and Nepal. And we raised £2 million to give a reusable sanitary kits and start building toilets in areas where women were experiencing menstrual exile and had no access to sanitation. Because if you're a Dalit woman, you know, your sanitation is directly related to your dignity, you know, it directly impacts a woman's dignity and her place in society. And because if you don't have, you know, girls were dropping out of school because they didn't have access to toilets and periods products, and that impacts education. And if a girl doesn't get education, it impacts her place of occupying spaces in the world where decisions are being made, where decision making is happening, which obviously impacts women from being in those places like parliaments and other places where huge decisions about the environment and today's world building is happening. And if women don't get a chance to go to school, they lose out on everything. And all of this starts from something so simple as menstruation. The whole thing is linked. In, again, as I said, it's intersectional. It completely is linked. So I did that. We made a lot of noise and it got published everywhere. But it was, I mean, I did a lot of like public campaigns. And finally, they changed the law in 2018 where they criminalized the practice, and they started finding people and putting them in prison for women they saw were being sent into exile. So there was some change and impact we saw, but you know, changing a law and changing hearts and minds is a slightly different thing, especially in such oppressive societies. Where it's so deeply, misogyny is so deeply ingrained, you know, that it is really hard to break. And then recently I just launched another project called Sisters of the Moon. And again, I partnered with WaterAid, and we together launched this campaign called Thirst for Knowledge. And it was to keep girls in school, in education, and how to sort of facilitate those things. And we raised 5.6 million, and they're still verifying the figures, but to sort of open up schools for 30,000 people in the Bardia district of Nepal. And so, yeah, so my work has always been linked with like a real sort of action-based activism and infrastructure-oriented sort of activism, rather than just telling the story and getting it published and then disappearing, you know, because I'm a post-colonial artist and I have certain responsibilities about the people who get involved in my work and tell their stories. That Speaks also was a VR project with 3 VR immersives were created, where women invite you into their own space and you experience what the exile is with 3 different women of 3 different ages. And it's a very sensorial, visceral experience, and it really shakes you because it kind of breaks that binary that exists between the white cube and, say, people from our part of the world, you know, and it really puts you into that space because it's such an immersive medium, and it makes you have a more sensorial experience of what it is to be a woman, experiencing such abuse of human rights, and also, you know, doing it on her own agency. Because when you're making a 360 video in VR, you leave, you know, it's just the camera and the woman. So she takes upon herself and her agency to like tell you her story on her own terms. It's completely different from, say, photography or traditional filmmaking, so I used multiple different forms of mediums to sort of target different places. And now I'm working on a new VR installation of a new project and a graphic novel and a photo book to again continue telling the stories of women and the journey of shame and empowering and world building in different ways, and how that impacts our world today, and why social practice is so important. And the problem with when after I went there, I felt like it became a poverty tourism. National Geographic was flying their photographers there, New York Times was flying their photographers there, and it becomes poverty tourism. There's nothing, never goes back to the community. I mean, the news cycle is so small, and when you have people from the communities and girls, women like us who've already told the story, why would you keep on re-victimizing people who've already in a difficult situation? You surely have to move beyond that and figure out a way that you can put it back towards the community and engage them. Because for me, hope is not just merely raising awareness. For me, it's combining real action with a socially engaged practice, so it's more than just, I mean, for me, photojournalism is pointless unless it's much better to be an activist or an artist and combining, social practice into your work rather than just, again, being that moral arbiter of truth and trying to, tell you that this is what is happening. So I feel like poor people and people from dispossessed communities also have agency. They also have the voice to tell their own stories, and it's really important that we put them in the center of it and make them reclaim their own narratives. And I'm just a facilitator in that process.
And that's a very powerful way of dealing with those feelings of shame and dignity that you spoke about earlier, the damage to dignity, and how problematic and how loaded it is to photograph in a photojournalist style as an international photographer going to a particular site. So yes, I think that approach to reciprocity and respect and agency is so powerful and so interesting in your work in terms of a response to empowerment in response to shame. I'm being a bit wordy here, but you get my point. I think it's incredibly powerful, and you spoke about that very well. Thank you. I think it's extraordinary, your practice as well. And you touched on a little bit about your approach to collaboration and how you seek to draw others in through your practice. And you spoke about the receipt work. But I'm wondering if you can talk about some other major collaborative works that you might have done in Queensland.
Oh, okay. Weirdly, there are a series of paintings. But they do draw upon kind of photographic references. So I'd like to talk about my practice in relation to it being grounded within a lens. So the outcome might not be lens-based like a photo, but there's a lens within the work. And so the series of works that you're actually thinking about is called Collaborative Racist Paintings, which draws its inspiration off a series of Dulux paint color names, which all have the word Oriental in them, to kind of unpack the racial kind of nature of language and how it's either been forgotten or been so normalized that people don't realize how loaded certain words are. And so it's a process of creating, and it's an ongoing project, but currently sits at 101 works with 104 different people. And it's, I make the works, I send them to people, they finish them, and they keep them within their possession. So in doing that, it is what I call a dispersed archive that challenges notions of collecting of the museum, but also asks people to consider racial violence and race within their lives, or how they've contributed to it, or how they've experienced it, to try to unpack the ways that they exist in the world. And so the work was actually called back for Asia Pacific Triennial last year. I think it's still up for a few more weeks in Queensland. But one of the key, there's a lot of problematics in the work in that it deliberately complicates the way in which the works are called back and loaned, because they're loaned from 104 different people. Structurally, I designed it very rigidly, and that pretty much was broken away through the collaboration process. So being open to being challenged through your collaboration is really crucial to the way that I operate. And the ownership isn't mine. So it's really important to understand that these works, when they were returned to the museum, was at the discretion of the person who has possession of it. And so there was one work that was withheld from the museum structure to make a comment on the colonial framework at which all institutions in Australia practice. Whether or not it's a successful work is another issue, but kind of the collaboration expands and it omits white men as well. So there are white women in the work, because I feel that there's interesting considerations around how white women view themselves when looking at racialized frameworks and colonial frameworks. And I think that's something that needs to be examined more closely. We don't need the opinion of white men, really, when it comes to race. But yeah, the work itself is complicated in the way that it's organized and dispersed. It challenges notions of collecting and archiving as well.
And another thing that strikes me about all three of your practices, while you have a strong sense of responsibility to others, to the planet, your work is also very personal, and there's a personal element in all three of your practices. Shahidul, I might ask you if you could speak to that personal element in your practice and why that's important as well.
Well, I'll come back first to the things that others were talking about in the collaborative process, because if one believes that in that injustice, one must also look to see where one is positioned himself or herself. And while I was challenging this white Western photographers coming in and photographing in my country, I recognized that I, as a middle-class male photographer, was also in a position of power. So when I'm photographing a woman in a slum who has no door to shut on my face, my position is that from the upper end of the power spectrum, and she has very little say in how that process works. So we began two things. One was to train women photographers. I mean, the agency was set up in '89. In '92, we started training women photographers and set up an association called Unno Chokedaka, Seeing with Another Eye, which is the first women's collective of photographers, which went to do very, very interesting work. In '94, we started training working class children, teaching them photography. And I'll just show you this picture, if you can see it. The reflection is there. Okay, that is a group of kids I started teaching in 1994. It was meant to be going on for 6 weeks. It continues, and the kid on the right of the frame holding the baby kitten is now the head of our gallery at DRI. So those are transformations that have taken place at a very practical level. But in terms of the more personal things, I've actually used my personal experience as part of that as well, in the sense that, you know, while I was in jail, I mean, not that I'm recommending jail to anyone, but for me, it was a very powerful experience in the sense of getting to know how my state operates, getting to know fellow prisoners and what their role is. I brought out a book once I came out, and this is a segment of artifacts I collect while I was there, but also work by other artists depicting my position. And the picture at the bottom here, this one, is sketched by a fellow prisoner while I was in jail. And one of the things we did was we started painting, and so there are now over 35 huge giant murals inside the jail, which were done by the prisoners. There's a vegetable patch. We started art literacy classes. They wanted musical instruments, so I asked my friends and they sent in musical instruments. We set up a musical band. They've written over 40 songs, and most of them are now on YouTube. So a huge range of things has happened during that time. But while I'm doing this, I'm actually trying to rifle through my book to try and find another image. And this for me is very interesting. This image over here, the one with the boat, I was in hospital, in prison, when the prisoners wanted one of my pictures. So I managed to get a book smuggled in. And when I came out, there was this giant mural based on one of my photographs, which they had painted in my honor in jail itself, and it's still there. So this relationship with my fellow prisoners became very, very important for me and continues. A lot of what I do now, having come out, is to work with fellow prisoners, is to find space for them to say things they weren't able to say. And while there is obviously injustice at many levels, people who are incarcerated are perhaps the most vulnerable because their voice is completely blocked out by these very dense, opaque filters that they have to go through. The picture I showed you of the sketch was how prisoners talk to visitors, and it's through 3 layers of bars and this huge sound. So what we had to do was to develop a sign language mechanism to just be able to talk to one another. But that was how the message came out. And in my case, I thought I was, in a sense, a messenger for my fellow prisoners and being able to speak out for them. So it's not so much just me, it is what I use my presence for.
Thank you. That's a very powerful point. Palomi, you've got a show on at the moment that you've made in response to your relationship with your mother, but there's certainly a personal element in your broader practice. Could you perhaps speak about that idea of the personal in a political practice or in a practice that is geared towards human rights and social justice?
Yeah, so sorry, am I on mute? No. For me, I think my practice is very personal. It's always been because, when I was 17, I lost my father, and my mother told me to leave home to be able to live a life of full choices that she wasn't allowed to, because I grew up in a very patriarchal, misogynistic home. So I left home pretty early, and I've been on adventures one after the other. And some of the things I've carried forward, because both my mother and my grandmothers were both child brides, and then they grew up to become very young widows. So I have seen like this kind of sort of oppression and patriarchy and misogyny very closely, starting from my own home. So it's something I knew best, something I understand well, something I feel I can truly be able to, carry that message forward and get other people to be able to do that as well, because real feminism is really about opening up that pathways and channels so other women can walk the paths that you're creating or other ancestors before you have created. Because so it's something I feel like I should be working in, something that I understand well and I know well, because that's where the authenticity really lies. And it all comes from you at the end of the day. So going back to the fact that our bodies are sites of, as sort of as bodies from the global south, as a South Asian woman, I truly feel that both me and my mother, our bodies are sites of political warfare, and the work is about sort of inheriting that and challenging that, and sort of coming out to tell our own stories of resistance, to stand in solidarity with all the women that have told me their stories in 15 years of my career. of sort of working on underreported stories and working and trying to empower other people along the process. I felt like it all comes from here. So the work is kind of the origin of all my practice. It's called Fireflies. It's showing at Autograph. It consists of photography, a dance performance, a science fiction film, and also sculptural fabrics. And it really is about sort of, again, the idea of generational trauma and how our bodies go through so much pain and injury, and as women, and how not only as like women now, but also as women of color, of oppressed, we have a history of pain and injury, and how we reclaim that and how we take agency of that, and we come to tell you our stories and present that in a world so that we question generational trauma, we question that so that we don't have to pass it down to another generation. And that's a huge thing to face and challenge and be able to take on, because we're all complicit in passing down trauma in one way or the other, from everything we faced in our lives. And the idea was to sort of bring it back to myself, but also address larger issues of resistance and world building and self-care and agency, something that as brown women, we just don't even know what that is. We don't know what self-care is. No one's ever taught us that. We don't know what it is to love our bodies, to conquer our shame, and to be able to like expose them in a way that, to feel that untamed, joy in that, and to have a mother and daughter's body intertwined together, because, the power of the womb and where that comes from, it's a very personal body of work, but it's also heavily political, and it will never get shown in India. Like none of my work ever gets shown there, because nobody wants it, nobody wants to show it, because possibly it's so political that it's just, they're not going to. When I met Arundhati, she told me that you should never give up on your Indian passport because they will never let you come back. The only reason you can make this is because, you still have your Indian passport. The minute you give that up, you will never be able to come back. So, yeah.
And Phuong, the last word to you before we open up to questions on that element of the personal and the extent to which the personal helps with your political practice.
Yeah. So for me, I'm always looking at a lot of disparate things that might not be connected, and then somehow bring them together to comment on something that is contemporary. So as the child of Vietnamese refugees, for example, I made a work called My Dad, the People Smuggler. And it's just him telling his story about how he helped people flee. But it's the trick in that work is kind of in the titling of it, particularly within the context of Australian contemporary politics. And the idea of this kind of evil other as a smuggler, and by familiarizing him through naming the work as such, you're kind of drawing a direct link to kind of that kind of contemporary political recent history and ongoing history as well. So they're the kinds of things that I do. I mean, one of the works that pops up on screen behind us is called A World Vision, and it uses archival footage of two French ladies throwing coins out at Vietnamese children and one man, as kind of this entertaining charity. And so I like that work pairs it up with Mary Poppins' Feed the Birds, which speaks to Catholicism and charity, and really trying to pull apart kind of the charitable industrial complex of the West, and viewing it as a form of imperialism that is ongoing through, and we talked about this just before, philanthropic kind of operations in kind of the one percenters deciding how charity is dealt and handled, and how it is an economy within itself. So I kind of ground everything in the personal. Everything is personal, and it was nice to hear people talk about positionality in all of this as well, because I a lot of my work tries to understand my positionality in relation to these key issues and how they relate to me on a personal, familial, and community-orientated kind of perspective. I jokingly say I do kind of capitalize, like commodify trauma as well as a way of dealing with it, because in making art, you are literally commodifying something. You know, I think speaking from someone who grew up and lives in the West, the responsibility for myself is to make sure that the right messaging gets to my elders. So in my exhibition that is part of Photo 2020, there's a really uncomfortable work that deals with the extreme right-wing kind of radicalization of our elders within the Vietnamese population in the diaspora. A lot of them are Trump supporters. A lot of them are white nationalists, surprisingly. And I don't know how to address this. And so I make work to try to navigate. So I like to talk about my practice as a form of comprehension in trying to understand what can be done to minimize the impact on that certain social and political issues might have on people who are marginalized, who don't have a voice. You know, when I opened the exhibition, I made sure, because we are here in Australia, we are leading to a national federal election. And it was really important to tell people that you don't vote for yourself, you vote for the person who doesn't have a vote, you vote for the undocumented migrants, you vote for asylum seekers and refugees, you vote for children. And for their rights, you vote for the people who don't have voices, and you need to think about them when you vote as well. And so that's kind of what I try to do in my practice, given that my positionality is someone who is of a certain class strata purely because of the circumstances in which I was born into. And a lot of that has to do with social mobility and understanding how that has occurred one generation in from being kind of the child of refugees, migrants.
Thank you, Phuong. Lindsay, do we have time for a question or two? One quick question. Does anyone in the live audience or on Zoom have a question? Elias.
While thinking of questions, just to point out, Palomi, one of the points of building institutions was to create space. And while your work might not be welcome in India and would not generally be welcome in Bangladesh, at DRIC, we are free to show anything. We make a point of that. So, but both of you, we'd love to show your work here.
That's great, Shahidul. Thank you. Anik dhonnobad. And we must keep our conversation going. Yeah. So we can see what we can do, you know.
Yep, likewise, thank you for the invite. I know a lot of my work is contentious in Vietnam, so as well. So I would never show in Vietnam. There's a complication about being part of a diaspora, that you don't necessarily belong here where you exist and live and work and play and are born. But I don't belong in Vietnam either. And there's a huge habit of diaspora traveling back to, and I use quotation marks, where they're from, and inflicting a level of Western imperialism on their people as well. And so we need to kind of acknowledge that as people who grow up in Western traditions or are trained within a Western context as well, and the kind of the violations that we enact on our own people in that process.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fantastic. Thank you, Shahidul, Palomi, and Phuong, for that fabulous conversation. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you both.